So often, we kind of look to experts to give us insight on how our kids are growing and developing. An example of that would be our podcast. We look to Dr. Kathy as an expert who has done research and now is giving us insights on how we can walk well with our kids through this moment. But what do we do when places give expert advice that we don't think is actually good for our kids? How should we field surveys and studies, for example, that look at gender dysphoria and tell us that we should call our kids to transition? Well, today in the Celebrate Kids podcast, in our daily segment, Facing the Dark, we're going to look at one study and actually some responses to that study from other researchers who challenge the findings' results. And Dr. Kathy's going to give us some insights on how we can kind of think well in this moment of living and educating and training our kids with a scientific perspective, but then also how we can step into that, specifically with the area of gender dysphoria, and raise our kids to have confidence and courage to build their identity on something that is whole and firm. So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, a highly touted survey from 2021 that came from Tavistock's Gender Identity Development Service in England followed 44 children between the ages of 12 and 15 to look at the impact of puberty blockers, medicines that are designed to postpone puberty in children. And they wanted to find out what was happening with these children, specifically how their mental well-being was. But recently, 2 researchers have gone in and reviewed that research and have come to a different conclusion, because the original study said that puberty blockers did not affect the mental well-being of children. Now, new analysis looks at how each individual fared, and they found that it was greatly different from the original survey findings. They're finding that 34% of the children deteriorated mentally, and 29% improved, and 37% had no change at all. Now, some are saying that this type of research should really be fully embedded in the development of new services for children and young people who are expressing gender incongruence. So, Dr. Kathy, I wanted to bring this up because the Tavistock Gender Identity Clinic that was in England has kind of hit pause on everything. They're really reconsidering what we had kind of thought of as gender identity science, if you want to call it that kids really could change and we could put puberty blockers into their systems and into their kind of treatment plans to help with some different mental challenges, and it wasn't going to affect them. But now everyone pretty much around the world, except for the United States, is hitting pause because they're finding that these original surveys and studies aren't actually what we thought they were. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Kathy, as we kind of think about what the rest of the world is doing and what the United States is doing?
I'm really glad you brought this to our attention, and I'm also very glad that I had a few minutes to look this over today before coming on the podcast with you, because it reminds me of something that's a bit hard to admit, but I'm going to do it. Researchers can prove whatever they want to prove. I know when I was a PhD student and working on my research, read hundreds and hundreds of research studies looking for a variety of things and trying to figure out what I was going to do with my time. And it was so obvious to me that if a researcher wanted to prove X, you could prove X. There's just a way to do it. There's questions you ask. There's data you don't collect. There's data you collect and you massage it in a particular way. So this reminds me that we better be careful times 2 of everything we read and believe. And we better go back to the original source. Who are the people doing the research? What was their perspective going in? Did the original researchers want to prove that mental health would be fine? Then they proved it. In this case, we have some people who I believe were ethically minded, who wanted to look for real results, and they found something that is extremely important for us to understand. The fact that a third of the kids deteriorated mentally, and a third had no change. And you would think that if they were truly gender dysphoric and needed puberty blockers to, lift their attitudes or whatever, that there would have been a much higher percentage that had a positive growth in their mental health from sadness to joy or from depression to hope or whatever they were looking for. So again, let's be really careful of who we believe and what we look at. And let's believe from this new data that changing gender is not what some of these young people need. They think they do. It's convenient. It's the topic du jour. It gets them noticed, but it may in fact not be anything relevant to the angst that they're feeling.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's really important for us to think through. I mean, the reality here in this survey that we're finding is really 7 out of 10 had no change or deteriorated mentally from this kind of, I would say, kind of intervention in their natural kind of development and growth. And in that, John Stonestreet has said many times, I've heard him say that, statistics aren't necessarily destiny for individuals, but they are or can be for society. So when we see this kind of research, what's important for us to understand as we care for kids? How should we as individuals caring for kids kind of receive this new data? And should it be something that we kind of are mindful of as we look at, especially, not only just statistics and kind of the medical community, but also the different voices that are kind of speaking to us? How can we encourage kids knowing this?
Yeah, I hope that what I've already said is relevant to that. I would think also, Wayne, we've got to look at things like the sample study. Like, did they study 100 young people or 1,000 young people? And how do they know? I don't know. There's just so much here that we better be careful of, because John Stonestreet is correct that when statistics get out, there are many people who start to act in a particular way because they're led by those numbers, and then it does change society and it will affect even individuals within that society. So it's very, very important. I think it's one of the things it says to me is that children don't always know what they need. Like, these children in this study thought that they, or think that they're gender dysphoric and that they're in the wrong body and that they need to make that change. And so I want to take puberty blockers so that, it's easier to become the opposite gender. They thought that would work. It wasn't positively affecting their mental health. In fact, it was deteriorating it, as you've pointed out from the research. And so I think that's evidence that we better stand up against our kids and say, no, that's not what you need. You're young, you're experiencing bullying and tattling and weird moments, and you have a friend who dismissed you and you're lonely, and so you're thinking these things, but what if those aren't the right things to be thinking? This is where we stand up and say, I have more life experiences than you do. Let me tell you what I think is going on here.
Yeah, I think that's really true. It's really important for us to understand. But I think that there's also another side of that where, it's really challenging for those of us that love and care for kids to kind of see them struggle. And I know that you've written on this, how to build kind of resiliency in kids. But what if that struggle for our kids is really something that we look at as really maybe kind of existential to the human experience, if I could use some big, like 50-cent words there, right? That really part of being human is kind of being male or being female, right? That God has really created us as embodied beings, and he's done it really on purpose. But when our kids are battling with something to this degree, really their gender identity, what can we do as parents? Because it's hard for us to see them struggle in that way. How can we come alongside and really give them support so that their identity isn't kind of less than their gender, but it also isn't more than their gender? And in that battle, how can we kind of guide them? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I love the way that you've worded that. So let me say what we've said here before on the podcast, Facing the Dark, and that is that gender dysphoria is real. So the first thing to say is that there are children, sadly, who really do have the belief that they're in the wrong body. So I don't want anything that I've said here to be dismissive of that. If you believe that that's the case, then you get them help. You get them mental health help. And you find in my opinion, a Christian counselor, maybe with experience, ideally with experience in this area, who loves the generation and is able to talk about what's really going on here. And then you answer questions and you get the kind of help that they need. And it's not a surgical medical intervention for a mental health problem. That's something that I will say over and over again. I think we do need to get these kids role models. As a very stereotypical kind of example is, men are supposed to like football and not be creative and artistic. And that's ridiculous. That's a lie from the devil. But if you're raising a young son or a young adult man, who's very creative and artistic and is feeling less than a male because he doesn't care about NFL football, which is now on Sunday afternoons, introduce him to some men who love art. And, go to the art museum with him and show him that you love art. If you're the dad, the uncle, the father, the stepfather, whatever, the grandfather and, celebrate, go to Hobby Lobby together and watercolor together. Those are the kinds of things we can do. If you've got a young woman who doesn't cry easily and she feels less than a female because females are supposed to be all emotive and not all of us are, then you walk with her and you help her understand, the definition of male and the definition of female according to Scripture. And one more thing, and something that I write about and talk about, and that is that our children today, Wayne, they need a complete identity. Gender is part of it. And frankly, I think it's a minor part for most of us. I don't wake up thinking I'm a woman today. It just is my reality. I'm a tall woman. So I'm a tall woman with a low voice. There's things that are true. But we have an intellectual identity, an emotional identity. What about our feelings? We have a social identity. Are we loyal and dependable and responsible and outgoing and confident and friendly? And are we good with small groups and big groups? And we have, again, emotions. We have, fear and joy and gratitude and love. And then we have, again, the intellectual side of life of academics. We have the physical side of life of our appearance and our physical ability and our physical health. And we have the spiritual side of life where we're, in my case, your case, we're Christ followers devoted to the work of the Lord and we love His word. Talk to your children about all of who they are so that when any part of that doesn't feel safe to them that day, their intellectual self kind of crumbles one day when they don't earn the grade they thought they would earn, they have other things that they can depend upon. Those are important lessons.
There's a passage out of Luke chapter 5 that I was reminded of as Dr. Kathy was talking. I'm going to begin reading at verse 27. Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi. He was sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. I think I was reminded of this passage and really the story of Levi because there was so much that Levi kind of in many ways had going for him. And in many ways, he was finding himself kind of in the way of the world, living according to it, living according to the structure of what the Roman culture was kind of giving him. And seeing Jesus, Levi got up and found his identity in Jesus. So much so that he left everything behind and followed Christ. Now, I think sometimes as parents, that's what parenting is in a Christian worldview. It's looking at the things of the world and saying, our identity is not in the science, and it's not in the data, and it's not in all of these different things that the world kind of says are important for us as we're raising young people in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And I think as we're taking in the things that Dr. Kathy's talking about here today, and even throughout the course of this week, there is one truth that we can cling on to. Jesus celebrates kids, and He invites us into that. And I hope that that's an encouragement for you. And I hope this whole podcast has been an encouragement for you this whole week. And if it has, would you send us a note? You can just send me a quick email at wayne@ignitethefamily.com. That's WAYNE@ignitethefamily.com. I'd love to pass along some of your thoughts and insights to Dr. Kathy, just as an encouragement for us as we continue on in what God is calling us to. And with that, I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this, our daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender. I want to say thanks for listening, and we're really looking forward to seeing you here again on Monday.